Jade arrives at her in-laws' house for Thanksgiving only to find the household empty except for Brady's stepfather, Victor. A note explains the family has gone on a Caribbean cruise without them. Jade discovers Brady's betrayal, affair, and theft of their savings. Victor reveals he's terminal, has been documenting years of neglect and financial exploitation by Brady and Elaine, and far from helpless, has hidden assets and a plan. Jade and Victor create a theatrical ruse of Victor's rapid decline, gather neighbors' testimony, and finalize legal documents transferring Victor's major assets to Jade and Charity. Victor dies peacefully. Jade reveals the evidence and the new will when Brady and family return, leaving them disinherited and exposed. Jade departs to start anew. She arrived to an empty house that smelled faintly of rain and antiseptic. The front hall lamp hummed. A single note lay under a ceramic bowl of keys. Jade unfolded it like a small accusation. Gone on a cruise with my ex. You stay and take care of Victor. Brady. The handwriting was neat, practiced, and instruction disguised as thoughtfulness. The living room was clinical. One lamp, one rocking chair, a throw folded like a folded handkerchief. Victor sat in the chair as if he had been waiting for her to make the mistake of arriving. He'd been seen asleep earlier in the driveway by the neighbor, but here he was awake, body bent around the cane, eyes clear as winter glass. "Shall we begin?" he asked. The words landed soft but heavy. They had the compulsory calm of people who have rehearsed something wrong until it felt inevitable. Outside, November light slanted through bare branches. Jade's groceries, cranberries, a bag of sweet potatoes, a pie crust tucked into a cooler bag looked absurdly festive against the house's quiet. Her phone vibrated. Brady's number, then silence. An Instagram ping, Brady, smiling on a cruise deck, arm around a blonde woman. A caption, new beginnings. Her chest hollowed out. 2 mornings, 3 missed calls, and a photo that erased the months she'd surrendered for the sake of a promise. Victor watched the phone with mild curiosity, then tapped his temple. They think I'm a tissue they can wipe their hands on. They were always good at choosing convenience over people. The line didn't strike sentiment. It registered like a judgment. He poured cold water into a glass with hands that trembled but did not betray panic. Jade felt sudden, bland fury. Not the movie kind, but a slow, practical heat that gathered like cloud. Brady took money, she said. The sentence was small but perfect. It anchored the looseness that had been forming around her heart. Victor nodded and shifted, revealing a stack of manila folders on the end table, neat, labeled, small betrayals organized into a ledger. For a moment she thought it must be a trick of grief, a man preparing tidy boxes for the people who used to love him. But when she opened one, the ledger bled numbers, withdrawals that matched the weeks the household had seemed inexplicably thin. "This can't be right," Jade whispered. It was. 2 months of missing refill receipts, canceled appointments, heat turned low to save money. A photograph of Brady smiling in a tux with expensive cufflinks, timestamped the same week a large withdrawal emptied Jade and Brady's small joint savings, money she had earmarked for a down payment on a house. The bruise of betrayal on her life was now visible in ink. Victor tapped a pen against his knee, an old banker's habit. "They thought leaving me with you was mercy," he said. "No. They left me exposed. That's different." He reached beneath his chair and produced a small, worn notebook. The cover flap was filled with dates and details, minutiae that revealed patience and a reduced appetite for illusions. "I don't have much time," he said, and Jade understood that the house had been emptied not for lightness, but because everything else had been weighed and found wanting. He offered a crooked smile that was not quite invitation and not quite command. "If you're staying," he said, "then let's not waste it." The sentence was a small map, not revenge yet an appointment, dignity. Outside, a wind pushed dry leaves along the driveway, as if the world itself were impatient for the reckoning to begin. In the small kitchen the house revealed its neglect as if by accident. Frosted milk past its date, a half-empty sugar jar, a refrigerator whose shelves had been treated as suggestion rather than obligation. Jade unpacked her groceries and felt, absurdly, like she had been dropped into someone else's life. She placed the turkey breast on the counter with deliberate care. Ritual calmed panic. She could roast, carve, set a table, small acts that would say, silently, people matter here. Victor moved slowly, but when he spoke he was sharp. He told her of missed palliative visits, of an appointment with a specialist cancelled on a whim. Elaine, his wife, had told him she needed a break. Brady had called it timing, vacations, work conferences, politics of small marriages. The ledger proved otherwise. Transactions marked as home supplies that paid for dinners out. Refill dates that didn't match prescriptions. The numbers gathered into a picture of routine theft, small amputations from a life until the whole was hollow. You should go to the bank, Victor said. His voice carried no plaintiveness, only a pragmatic request. I can't trust the papers around here. Jade, trembling in the fluorescent light, opened the banking app and found the line of withdrawals, $5,200. Her throat closed. That was nearly all they had. That was the down payment. Brady's cruise selfies had a price tag, and it had been paid with the illusion of their marriage as collateral. They arranged a plan without dramatics, like two people cataloging evidence at a crime scene. Victor moved with shrewdness, an old banker's instinct, leading Jade into a back room that smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. A loose panel in the study revealed a sealed case, small deeds, an unlikely ledger, accounts she'd never heard of. The assets were not showy. A Vermont parcel, a nest of trusts, a name she'd never seen before on corporate filings. I made sure, he said. Not everything is a ledger they can raid. Jade's surprise tasted like relief. If Victor had hoarded more than memories, then their outrage had purpose. He wasn't merely a victim, he was an architect of contingency. She felt the contours of an ally form across the table, the soft click of strategy beginning to mesh. But the ethical edge of what they might do, expose the family, take legal control, turn his death into a weapon, settled between them like a cold coin. Both of them held it without flinching. They began to stage the smallest deceptions first, dimming lights, rearranging chairs, notes to neighbors. Patricia, Victor's attorney, a brisk woman with a clipped tone and a sympathetic eye, arrived as if on cue. She listened to facts like a seamstress fitting a dress. We'll need documented neglect, sworn statements, she said, pulling out a folder of forms. Legal scaffolding has its own clinical poetry, certified physicians to attest to lucidity, notarized amendments, witness affidavits. Each item they checked off felt less like vengeance and more like a moral ledger. Jade's role surprised her. Her professional habit, organizing visual chaos into clean files, became a weapon. She photographed empty pill bottles, matched prescription labels with refill dates. She collected neighbors' recollections one by one, learning to ask without accusation, to take testimony like beads on a string. An elderly neighbor, Edith, brought casseroles and stories. Mr. Collins at the bank remembered Brady's brusque complaints. Melissa, Brady's sister, left a message asking for updates. Those human details became scaffolding, not proof alone but texture, who visited, who didn't, what was left on the stove on the day the house was emptied. Through it all, Victor's humor remained. He taught Jade how to angle light for photographs that suggested decline, to choose language that would sway rather than inflame. They practiced phone messages, voicemails that sounded small and helpless, texts timed to pull them back. Make it real but not theatrical, he said. People will either return because of guilt, or they won't. If they don't, we do what's right anyway. There was a steadiness to his cruelty recognition. He had been betrayed before. Control was the only luxury left. As Thanksgiving approached, the house filled, not with relatives, but with a chorus of small witnesses. A neighbor who had shoveled Victor up after a fall, a bank manager with a memory for complaints, a hospice nurse who had been denied entry. Each voice affixed weight to their documentation. Together they sculpted a narrative that would be hard to dismiss, abandonment dressed as self-care, neglect labeled as economy. It was a slow, patient thing, a garden of proof grown so that when the family returned the harvest could not be denied. They rehearsed decline the way actors rehearse a scene, never fully comfortable, but fiercely determined. In the back bedroom, Victor let them practice the details. A slight wheeze, a measured slump, the pallor of a man who had fought for dignity against eroding days. Jade learned the small arts of caregiving, how to fold a blanket to support a shoulder, how to coax a reluctant sip of water. It felt intimate and ethically slippery, a negotiation of truth and necessity. The real twist was quieter than Jade had imagined. Victor's chest tightened one late afternoon and the clinical papers, scans, stage, prognosis, slid into a different present tense. The hospice nurse pulled Jade aside and said, gently, that the timeline might be shorter than they'd planned. It shifted the plan from theater to urgency. The staging of decline became a race against a genuine dwindling of days, and every decision acquired a moral compact: dignity first, strategy second. They accelerated notarizations and trust transfers. Patricia orchestrated signings in the bank's quiet office, where Mr. Collins, who had watched Brady's impatience for years, signed off on witnesses. Victor's instructions were precise: trusts for eldercare charities, a residual amount for Jade, stipulations that referenced abandonment and neglect. There was an odd poetry to it, a life rearranged on paper so that posthumous justice could be concrete. Victor recorded a video message. It was not an invective but a calm chronicle: dates, incidents, names, the small betrayals that add to a life's erosion. I am not writing from anger, he said into the lens, his voice even as gloves of memory warmed his hands. The camera became an incorruptible witness. In that small room, Jade felt the gravity of mortality reframe every petty grievance into a moral ledger. What is owed by love? What is owed by law? Neighbors trickled in, then became a chorus. Edith recounted the time she found Victor on the lawn and how Brady had watched television through the window. A shy neighbor described how he'd seen Elaine's SUV leave while Victor sat alone on the porch. The testimonies were small, human threads that, when woven together, made a fabric hard to tear. Patricia organized the statements into chronological bundles. Each signature was a pebble in a dam. In the middle of their preparations, Victor asked Jade about her marriage, not for gossip, but because he wanted a map of motives. She told him about incremental erosion, encouraging her to work from home, arrival of false equipment problems, the slow minimization of her friendships. He nodded, not in judgment, but as a man who recognized patterns. He'd seen them before. They don't see you as a person with a life, he said. They see you as a ledger to be balanced. The remark landed like a truth. This shared recognition shifted Jade. The problem was no longer simply Brady's infidelity or the stolen money. It was the normalization of small cruelties that add up, the systematic buying of excuses to remove conscience from daily life. The injustice became structural. That realization hardened Jade's hand. This was not just personal retaliation. It was preventing another person from being erased by the same family pattern. Then Victor's real decline arrived like a tide. A fever came overnight, a breath that drew shorter. When the hospice nurse predicted hours or a day, the plan bent but did not break. The video and the notarized transfers were already in motion. Patricia held the legal instruments, close like talismans. We move forward, she said. Now it becomes about his dignity. Jade felt the shift. What had begun as a strategy had become a vigil. The stakes were no longer merely to expose and punish, but to shepherd a life to a decent end while anchoring truth in documents that could not be flung away. They prepared the house for visitors, medical props tactfully placed, oxygen stands that breathed silence into the room. The camera cued. Jade caught herself in a mirror and barely recognized the woman who had been embarrassed and betrayed a week ago. There was focus now, an economy of motion that honored Victor's last wish and protected what remained of both their lives. They were no longer performative. They were caretakers who had learned to use the law and light to ensure a man's final testament would be heard. The day the family was due back, the house looked like the intersection of two realities. One corner held a careful, almost reverent staging, pill packets labeled, an oxygen tank in place, monitors that blinked like mute weather. The other corner held the evidence, folders in neat stacks, annotated timelines, neighbor statements clipped to sticky notes. Every object had intent. It was a domestic altar to accountability. Brady's voice came over the threshold the minute his boot crossed the mat, bright, sunburned, casual. He and Elaine burst in carrying duty-free bags, laughter still clinging to their shoulders like a scent. They scanned the room quickly, as if they expected someone to leap up and apologize for an absence. Instead, they found Jade in a simple black dress and the empty rocking chair like an accusation. Victor's letter sat where they could not miss it, cream envelope, a name, handwriting steady despite frailty. Jade placed it on the mantel like a metronome. She had learned to read small faces, Brady's practiced ease, Elaine's polished impatience, and she anticipated their moves. But anticipation doesn't blunt the charge of humiliation. The first seconds were a slow, awkward tightness. "Where is he?" Elaine demanded, breath high with entitlement. Jade told the truth plainly. Victor had died. Brady's smile slid into a pale mask. The reading began not like an execution, but like a requiem. Victor's words were less about accusation and more about a particular kind of heartbreak, being seen as an expense, not a person. As Jade read, the room's air shifted. Hannah retreated to the doorway, Melissa's expression unraveled. The bill of particulars, missed appointments, diluted medications, late-night jokes at the expense of his pain, accumulated into unbearable clarity. Then Patricia entered, quietly professional. In her hand, a set of documents that would make the room pivot. As executor, she said, "I will read the relevant clauses." The will spelled out precise disinheritance and transfers to charities. The legal language was dry but devastating. Brady tried to speak. The words clattered against the solid surface of notarized instruments. He accused Jade of manipulation. The accusation fell flat against the video cued on the TV. Victor, lucid and composed, naming dates and facts, describing the slow theft of care. The camera's unblinking lens had captured the dignity of an old man who refused to be reduced to rumor. Elaine's posture shuddered into something like realization, then anger. She lunged for the evidence, flipping bank statements and splintering the family's narrative of benevolent caretaking. Brady's protests became scattershot, threats to contest, cries of injustice. Patricia responded with clinical calm. The documentation satisfied standards of capacity and witness. She explained the reason legal challenges would not be trivial: signed medical assessments, notarized instruments, witnesses sworn to written testimony. The family's currency, assumption, and habit would not suffice. Melissa, hearing how college funds had not been set up, turned on Brady with a small, fierce grief. Hannah slipped toward the door, the affair's blush meeting the cold logic of exposure. The living room trembled with domestic collapse. Brady's threats became personal pleas as he confronted what his actions had cost him: security, inheritance, and perhaps the last shreds of family respect. Jade watched him falter and felt no triumph, only a clear, steady sorrow and a hard, practical relief. This was not revenge masquerading as justice, it was consequence. Victor's final testimony had been less about punishment and more about truth, and truth has a way of reorganizing people. As the family argued, neighbors came forward, someone who'd driven Victor to an appointment and been pushed away, a bank teller who'd seen Brady impatient for cash. Each voice stacked like bricks. When Brady grabbed for Jade, pleading in an intimacy that had been false for years, she responded with a quiet clarity. She removed the ring and the keys and handed them back like a dismissal of a life that had never been reciprocal. The gesture was simple. Its weight was absolute. The room softened with something like grief, and then with the hollow sound of realization. The future that had been promised to them by assumption was no longer theirs to claim. The family's shouts faded to a harsh, bitter murmur. The house had become a courtroom and a chapel. Outside, the November day moved on unconcerned. Inside, Jade felt the hum of a life rebalancing. She had begun this week bewildered and abandoned. She ended it secure in the knowledge that dignity, when recorded and witnessed, could survive even the most unscrupulous conveniences. Silence followed Victor's recorded voice like a held breath. On the TV, his steady gaze met Brady's in a way that was deadlier than any accusation, a witness who would not be silenced. The family had come back to a house that honored the dead and refused to hide the selfishness that had shaped their absence. The lawsuit they threatened would not be cheap or tidy. The accounts had been frozen pending audit. The trusts were in place. The law, which had once been a distant room they assumed would be tamed later, now leaned into them like an insistent neighbor. Brady's pleas frayed into thin threats. "We can fix this," he said, voice begging for a mercy he had never shown. Elaine's lips tightened, a practiced mask losing its calibration. She demanded explanations. Patricia recited legal facts with the compassion of someone who had seen too many families eat themselves. He signed when he was lucid. "Witnesses corroborate. The will is testamentary and binding," she said, her voice steady as a metronome. The words were antiseptic but final. The room watched Brady's composure disintegrate. An aesthetic spectacle of entitlement collapsed into panic. Melissa sobbed quietly, less at the legal loss than at a new, bitter knowledge that money had been spent on vacations while promises were being bled from the household account. Hannah stood by the doorway, small and out of place, the physical symbol of the extramarital convenience that had been purchased at someone else's expense. When Brady stepped forward, fury and bargaining braided unpredictably. He accused Jade of cruelty, of manipulating a dying man. He tried to conjure the old intimacy offer, "We can get through this together," as if words could conjure what absence had taken. Jade met him with a stillness that had been forged over days of coffee, invoices, and the quiet sound of a man reading Raymond Chandler, aloud until the port warmed. She had learned to separate the person she had loved from the pattern he represented. "You left him," she said simply. The words were not theatrical, they were a ledger. "You chose cocktails and camera angles over his appointments. You spent what I saved." It was not a condemnation so much as an inventory. Brady's reaction, shock, then desperate calculation, had the shape of someone seeing consequences they'd presumed deferred forever. Victor's letter, read slowly and without excess, contained moments that cut deeper than courtroom language. He described feeling invisible, an obligation rather than a presence. He explained why he left his estate to someone who finally saw him, not because she engineered a scenario, but because she offered care and respect when those who were supposed to do so refused. The video testimony punctuated the legal picture with an emotional irreducibility. This man's words, in his voice, could not be recast as delusion. As the family wrestled with the implications, frozen accounts, revoked access, public humiliation, neighbors and witnesses continued to arrive. Each account tightened the net, the bank manager's recollection of Brady's impatience, Edith's account of shivering in a cold house while the family left for a holiday, the hospice nurse's notes documenting canceled visits. Together they formed a social verdict that law echoed. The combination was devastating because it was methodical rather than theatrical. No single crescendo produced the downfall. The collapse came through accumulation, data, testimony, moral clarity. Brady's final move was legal thunder, threats of challenge, promises of lawyers. Patricia's cool answer was to invite the challenge with a quiet confidence that came from organized facts. "Sue," she said. "Bring evidence." She had already anticipated the counterarguments and filed the defenses. It was the practical closure of the drama, not revenge as spectacle, but a defense mounted by those who had kept receipts. When the household finally quieted into stunned paralysis, Jade felt the cost settle in her chest. This had been a victory born of grief and care, not spite. Victor's last act, clear, deliberate, and compassionate, had secured something he felt he'd been denied in life, to be seen. Jade's leaving the house with a suitcase was not escape. It was the first step into an existence she could now shape without being unmoored by someone else's conscription. The climax was less a shout than the sound of weight shifting, money reallocated, dignity preserved, truth made public. She closed the front door behind her the way people close chapters, slowly, with an awareness that the sound would echo. The house behind her remained inhabited by the aftermath, voices entangled with legalese, the tremor of a family figuring out that inheritance is not entitlement. Jade walked to her car with a small suitcase and a larger, gnarlier sense of clarity. The sun cut across the windshield, bright and clean as new paper. At the hotel Patricia had arranged, Jade unpacked methodically. The documents that had once eaten at her nights were now boxes on a table, certified copies of transfers, Victor's video on a thumb drive, neighbor affidavits, bank confirmations. The tangible proof that had once felt like evidence of deceit now felt like ballast. She sat on the edge of the bed and found a quiet steadiness, not an end of grief, but a reorientation. She thought of Victor in the rocking chair, the way he had raised that flawed bottle of port and made a toast to dignity. The memory was simple and luminous, an ember that didn't burn so much as hold warmth. She had expected rage to be her primary sensation, but grief had been the one that surprised her most. Not grief for the life she lost, grief for the quiet life Victor had been denied. The legal aftermath would be messy, with appeals and accusations, with the family scraping at the edges of the law like predators at netting. Patricia had been clear, the family could contest, but against documented capacity, notarized instruments, and a video testimony, the odds were not in their favor. For Jade, that meant she could let the next months be about rebuilding rather than litigating. It meant that the house she had once dreamed of buying might become a real plan rather than a ledger of loss. Neighbors called over the next days with small kindnesses. Edith offered to bring over stew. Mr. Collins left a card with a note. These gestures stitched an unexpected community into the fabric of her days, proof that belonging is not only genetic but chosen. The public shame of Brady and Elaine did not bring joy, but a kind of societal correction, the neighbors' recognition that care is an obligation, not a commodity. Jade wrote a short note to Melissa, no recrimination, only an offer of pragmatic help with financial advice if she wanted it. The next months, she suspected, would be a time of reconstruction for many, a family fractured, a woman navigating independence, an elder who had chosen to shape his legacy. She felt oddly honored to have been entrusted with Victor's last wish and conscious of the responsibility. He had not saved her. He had built a way forward when the household had failed to do so. On the day she left the hotel to drive toward a modest apartment she'd once considered settling into, Jade paused and looked up at the bright November sky. The world was not kinder, only clarified. Justice had been slow and meticulous, but it had been real. Victor's last gift had been twofold, the practical security to breathe and the moral map to show how neglect can be made visible and accountable. She put on a playlist that Victor had liked, soft piano and late-night blues, and drove away. Her phone buzzed with a call she declined. There was a weight in silence now that felt like permission. She would grieve. She would regroup. She would remember the port and the book, the evening when Victor narrated his life like a man finishing a sentence with care. She would live differently, not to spite those who had failed him, but to honor the clarity they had given her. As the road unfurled ahead, Jade felt small and strangely large, both a survivor of a private betrayal and a vessel of a quiet justice that had been rendered in papers and witness and tenderness. Victor's last line, "She is the only one who earned the right," carried with it a question she now intended to answer in the living of her days.